King Louis XIV of France has been long regarded as the best example of absolutism in the 17th century. Absolutism is a system in which a ruler holds total power. King Louis was known for his aggressive foreign policy. He called himself the Sun King because the sun is the brightest star in the heavens and he thought he was the light for all of his people. He was born on September 5, 1638 in Saint-Germain-en-Laye, France, and christened Louis Dieudonné, French for gift of God. His mother was Anne of Austria, who was the Habsburg Spanish queen. His father was Louis XIII, King of France. Louis XIV also had a younger brother named Philip.
Champagne spilling, you should taste that.
I'm so fancy. You already know I'm in the fast lane. From LA to Tokyo, I'm so fancy. Can't you taste this gold? Remember my name. How to blow.
I said, baby, I do this. I thought that you knew.
When Louis was just 4 years old, his father passed away. He succeeded his father to the throne as a toddler, becoming the leader of 19 million French subjects and a highly unstable government. Chief Minister Cardinal Julius Mazarin, who was Louis's godfather, was responsible for tutoring the boy in history, politics, and the arts. Louis XIV, Governor Nicolas de Neufville, was appointed to keep watch over him, but since Louis almost drowned as a child, indicates that the monarch was overlooked as a child, if not as a ruler in the making.
The Parliament of Paris rebelled against Mazarin in 1648 when Louis was just shy of 10 years old. In an attempt to overthrow the crown, they waged a civil war called the Fronde against its supporters. Louis suffered many hardships throughout the war, including poverty and starvation. This helped shape Louis as a person because he never forgave Paris, the nobles, or the common people. In 1653, Mazarin finally achieved a victory. He constructed an extraordinary administration for the kingdom as Louis stood by and observed his mentor.
By this time, Louis had come of age but was afraid to question Mazarin's authority. Louis fell in love with Mazarin's niece, Marie Medici, a few years later, choosing duty over love. In 1660, he married Marie Therese of Austria, who was the daughter of the King of Spain instead. The marriage ensured ratification of the peace treaty that Mazarin had sought to establish with Habsburg Spain.
Got the whole world asking how I does that. Hot girl, hands off, don't.
Cardinal Richelieu was also one of Louis's chief ministers who strengthened the monarchy's power. When Mazarin died in 1661, when Louis was in his 20s, he became his own chief minister, thereby ending the long reign of cardinal ministers. He controlled his own government until his death in 1715. Louis set about reforming France according to his own vision when he came to the throne. The early personal reign of Louis was highly successful in both internal and foreign affairs. His first goal as absolute monarch was to centralize and reign in control of France.
With the help of Jean-Baptiste Colbert, his finance minister, Louis XIV established reforms that cut France's deficit and promoted industrial growth. In implementing administrative reforms towards a more orderly and stable French government, Louis forced provincial nobles to relinquish their form of political influence. Doing this, he constructed a more centralized administration with the middle class as its foundation. Colbert and the king shared the idea of glorifying the monarch and the monarchy through the arts. Money was lavished on buildings. Versailles, Louis XIII's hunting lodge, was transformed into a remarkable palace and park.
Louis was well known for his overbearing approach to foreign policy. In 1667, he launched the invasion of the Spanish Netherlands, deeming it his wife's rightful inheritance. The War of Devolution, as the conflict was called, lasted a year. It ended when the French surrendered and gave the land back to Spain. France's only conquest was to occupy a few towns in Flanders. Obviously, Louis was not satisfied with the outcome. He then engaged his country in the Franco-Dutch War from 1672 to 1678. During this, France managed to acquire more land in Flanders and the Franche-Comté. This victory promoted France to the status of a dominant power. This status positioned France as a threat to other European nations.
By the end of the 1680s, these nations responded by banding together to form the Great Alliance. A war between France and the Grand Alliance broke out in 1688 and it became known as the 9 Years' War. King Louis had begun to generate public hospitality by the 1680s, due in part to his efforts to establish religious uniformity throughout France. The king was a devout Catholic, and his persecution of the Huguenots came to a head with his 1685 revocation of the Edict of Nantes.
Under the Edict of Fontainebleau, Louis orchestrated the destruction of Protestant churches and schools throughout France and forced all children to be educated and baptized as Catholics. The revocation and the new edict served to alienate Protestants, prompting many to leave France and seek religious freedom elsewhere. France still held most of its original territory after the war against the Grand Alliance, but the country's resources were significantly drained. A war from 1701 to 1714, called the War of the Spanish Succession, further hastened Louis XIV's decline as a leader. In the war, Louis appeared to many of his subjects to place his personal interests above his country's.
The Long War was so costly for France that it prompted famine and placed the country in deep debt. The public went from hailing King Louis XIV as a hero to blaming him for France's financial devastation. On September 1st, 1715, a few days shy of what would have been his 77th birthday, Louis XIV died of gangrene in Versailles, France. Following his death, Louis's 5-year-old great-grandson, Louis XV, who was the last male heir of the Duke of Bongerie, inherited the throne.
On his deathbed, he advised his great-grandson not to imitate him in war. He said, "Try to always maintain peace with your neighbors, to spare your people as much as you can. I have had the misfortune not to be able to do so because of necessities of state." However, there is little indication that Louis XIV ever had any real concern for sparing his people.
In his reign, the human and material sacrifices demanded of the French people produced enormous casualties, financial exhaustion, and much bitterness. The king's intolerant religious policies permitted only Catholic worship after 1685 with the revocation of the Edict of Nantes.
The king's daily routine at Versailles was timed down to the last minute. He followed a strict schedule, as did all the members of the court, all regulated like clockwork. From 7:30 to 8 a.m., doctors, familiars, and a few favorites who enjoyed the privilege of the grand entries followed succession into the bedchamber of the king, who was washed, combed, and shaved every other day. The officers in wardrobe entered the grand lave, during which the king was dressed and breakfast was served to him.
At 10 o'clock, those who entered the king's bedchamber left and proceeded to a procession formed in the Hall of Mirrors. Followed by his courtiers, the king crossed the whole breadth of the grand apartment. This was the moment when the crowd gathered along the passage of the royal cortege was at least able to catch a glimpse of the monarch. The king sat in the tribune for about 30 minutes while the choir chapel music, renowned throughout Europe, sang a new song each day.
At 11 o'clock, back in his apartment, the king held council in his cabinet. On Sundays and Wednesdays was the council of the state. Tuesdays and Saturdays were voted to the council on finances, and on Mondays, Thursdays, and Fridays there might be an extra council of state. On these same days, the king might also decide to examine the progress of the building programs.
In his bedchamber, the king dined alone, sitting at a table facing the windows. The meal was a private one, but Louis XIV used it to receive all the men of the court, in general those present at the Louvre.
In the afternoons at 2 p.m., if he wished for a promenade, it was in the gardens, either on foot or in a carriage with the ladies. If he chose to hunt, it took place in the grounds where the king preferred to shoot, or in the surrounding woodland when he rode to the hounds.
At 6 p.m., Louis often let his son preside over the indoor entertainments. Meanwhile, he would sign the many letters prepared by his secretary and then go to the apartments of Madame de Maintenon, where he would study an important dossier aided by one of his 4 secretaries of state.
In the evenings at 10 p.m., the crowd squeezed into the antechamber of the king's apartment to attend the grand public supper. The king would sit at the table surrounded by members of the royal family.
At 11:30 p.m. was the retiring. A public ceremonial where the king withdrew to his bedroom was a shortened version of the leave.
In conclusion, King Louis XIV is regarded as the best example of absolutism in world history. He led an absolute monarchy during France's classical age.
He became king in 1643 and as of 1661 started reforming France. From 1672 to 1678, he engaged France in the Franco-Dutch War. In 1688, he led a war between France and the Grand Alliance.
By the 1680s, Louis generated public hostility. He died in Versailles, France, just before he turned 77 in 1715.
Kids that still have their cars at the club valet, and it's Tuesday.